Sisters, and in this video I'm going to show you how to join and sew all your blocks together on freshly picked, and then we're going to talk about doing the sashing on the back or doing the backing fabric on each section. So there's a couple of different ways you can do it. So let's go to the sewing room so we can learn how to do this. Okay, so I have sewn the top half of this smaller version of our freshly picked quilt, and when we did these videos we did it with adding the backing on the back of each block, and that's going to be a decision that you will make before you start making your blocks, of course. So the joining process in the end will be a little bit different, and basically it's just how you do the backing part of it. So since we've done it that way, all we need to do is to take our individual blocks to begin with, and we will just lay them out and make sure that everything is matching the way that it should be. Make sure your circle is completely full, that your alternating colors of fabrics are in the right place. Make sure you don't have anything turned or rotated incorrectly, and just double check it real quick before you begin sewing them together. So then what you'll do when you know you have it correctly is you'll just take one of the rows, stack them up like so, one row at a time, and we'll go to the sewing machine and lay it out there, and then we'll begin to sew them together. Okay, so here at the sewing machine I have my row all laid out, and this is the right hand side. You can start from the left to the right, whichever one you want, and you're going to look to see where you have some match points. So I have a match point, let's see, right here. I'll have a match point here, and also a match point there, and a couple other places where that stitching lines up. And of course there'll also be a match point at each of the corners. So you're going to take your blocks and put them right sides together and just line them up, and then you're going to take a pin and you're going to find the very corner of this, and you're going to put a pin just right through that corner. You can see how it came out there. It's right exactly on the corner, and then you're going to take the pin and put it right in the same corner on the block that you're going to stitch it together with, and you're just going to leave that pin in there. That's just going to be kind of like your anchor pin, and then you're going to find your next match point, which appears to be right here where this red stitching is, and it's going to come through to match the red stitching on the next block. Now this could be an intersection of fabric on a block. It all depends on which block you're sewing together. So then these are my two anchor pins to begin with. Now I'm going to take another pin, and this is the pin that I'll put all the way through. I'm going to put it through the seam allowance and then back into the quilt block on this side. And by doing that, it keeps your blocks from shifting and not being exactly lined up where they need to be. So start with your anchor pin right exactly through your match point, and then go ahead and take your actual pin you're leaving in there, put that through your seam allowance just like this, and then you can put that back through the block on the other side, and then you can remove your anchor pins. So you're going to do that all the way along here. Like this is probably another match point where that stitching comes together. And I'm going to actually start at this end on the corners again, and I'm going to leave this one in here. If I wanted to, I could drop my actual pin in there right now through the seam allowance and then back through the block. And you're just going to do this all along your block with as many pins as you feel comfortable with. So there, it's through the stitching there. It's a little bit off here, so I'm going to move my pin so that it's perfect. So there's my anchor pin, and then the pin that stays in there is going to go through the seam allowance and then back through the block. And we'll I'll just do one more right over here. Just peek through on the other side. If there's an adjustment to be made, go ahead and make that adjustment. So there's my anchor pin, and here's my other pin. Through the seam allowance right next to it, and then back through the block. So now the color of thread I'm going to use in the needle and the bobbin is going to be black, because this is going to be black here. So obviously don't want to use a white or the red or whatever, but I'm going to use black because it will show up a little bit less. So I think I'm ready to sew. So let me get my machine set up, and I'm just going to put it on a straight stitch with a walking foot, and then I'm going to be sewing right along that basting stitch, removing the pins as I go. Okay, I have black thread in the needle and also in the bobbin. I'm going to lengthen my stitch length. It's just a straight stitch length to like 2.8 to 3.0, and that's going to give it plenty of strength, because remember we've already added our backing, and we're going to be sewing a sashing strip to both sides of the seam, so there'll be plenty of strength in there. So what I like to do is begin, say about just before my pin, about 1/8 to 1/4 inch inside the block rather than at the very end. And then I like to do a couple back stitches and then go forward to lock that in place. And I am stitching right directly on the basting stitch and removing pins before I get to them. And at the end I will also do a little back stitch just to lock it in place. So there you can see how the stitching has lined up. You may also be able to see the white thread that you see there. That is the water soluble thread. And that of course is going to wash out either when you wash your quilt in the washing machine on a gentle cycle, or if you just want to dab it and gently brush it with a toothbrush or a cotton swab, that will definitely just wash right out of there. So now you can see why we use that on the edge of our blocks. So I'm going to go ahead and sew together all the other blocks in this row. Okay, so I have this row sewn together. I have also pressed the seams in the back of this row. And what I did is I pressed them to one side, opposite of the row above it. But I will tell you that this inside seam, as you can see, there's a lot of intersections and different seams coming together. So to press that to one side would have probably been, you would have been forcing it. You would have ended up with a lot of bulk in the seam. So if you ever are in a situation and it doesn't want to seem to go one way or another, it's okay to press those seams open, as it will make the sashing lay flat and have a lot less bulk after you add your sashing on there. So feel free to do whichever seems to be working best for you, since every block that's sewn together is a little bit different. So now I will go ahead and I will sew this row and then the final row together, and then we'll stitch our rows together so that we have two half sections, and then we'll start on our sashing. Okay, so now that I have my rows, my blocks sewn into rows for the bottom half, now it's time to take them and sew the rows together. So we're just going to put right sides together. We're again going to look for those match points, which would be right here and here, and of course the corners and the seams. So I'm going to begin pinning, and then I'll take it to the machine and we will start stitching the seam. So now that we have our blocks sewn into rows and we have it in 2 halves, there's our halves right there, you can decide whether you want to sew the seam together to make it complete and make it one full quilt. Kind of base it on the size and the ease of working with it. Sometimes it's just easier to work with something smaller and sash that rather than trying to sash a larger item. So when I talk about sash, what I'm talking about is we have raw edges on our back because we added our backing on this sample while it was in the hoop. So you need to make some sashing. And what you're going to do is on your trimmer by George, there's a marking for sashing, and it's 1.5 inches wide. So you'll cut your fabric 1.5 inches wide. And then over at the iron, you will press it so the raw edges meet on the back side. So you've got your wrong sides together with your raw edges meeting in the back, and just give it a good press, maybe a little spray starch as well. And so then what I have done is I've already cut my different widths that I needed. I'm trying to find where I joined it end to end. There it is. So right here is where I joined the 2 ends together, and I did it on the diagonal. And I did that just so that you don't have so much bulk going across there, just like you would do for binding. It's just that it's pressed a little differently. So this is my sashing. I've joined all my ends together. And if you have something small you're working on, or that is closer to the width of your fabric, like a 42-inch width of fabric, you can just go ahead and cut the strips and do your sashing without joining end to end. But I wanted to show you how to do that in this video. So now at the machine, you are going to put in the needle. I'm going to start with the bobbin. You're going to put in the bobbin some monopoly polyester invisible thread. And the reason you're going to be doing this, it's coming off my bobbin, but you're going to do this because you are going to sew like this with the pretty side of your quilt down. So you'll be sewing your sashing on like this. So you want your bobbin to be the clear, so that it shows up actually on the front side of your quilt, because you're going to be sewing through a bunch of different colors. So we would just put our sashing on like so, and then we would choose a serpentine stitch, which is just kind of a curvy back and forth stitch. Then we would sew this down on both sides. In the needle, you can have your choice of either matching your sashing, or you can also use the monopoly invisible thread also in the needle. So your choices are monopoly in the needle and bobbin, or just the bobbin and match your sashing, your needle thread to your sashing. So let's go to the machine and we'll get started. We'll actually sew our sashing over our raw edge seams. All right, my machine is set up, and I put monopoly monofilament thread in the needle and the bobbin. Here's my sashing, and this is the raw edge of the sashing on the back where the 2 raw edges are meeting. Here's my seam. And what I'm going to do is where the raw edge is in the center, I'm going to match that with my seam. I do have a seam allowance on the end of my sashing, so I'm going to scoot it out a little bit past the edge of the quilt. But then my sashing center is meeting up with the seam allowance where the seam is. So I'm just going to be, that's where I will lay it, and I'll do the serpentine stitch here on both sides. And move this so you can see. Okay, and I'm using a walking foot. And again, I'm just going to check underneath as I sew to make sure that the middle of the sashing strip is right over the top of the seam. And so then we can just start sewing our serpentine stitch. And you can sew the entire serpentine stitch on top your sashing, or you can kind of go half on the sashing and half onto the back of the quilt itself. As long as you catch the edge of that. And then I'm just double checking again to make sure I have it lined up correctly. You can use like a Wonder tape, double-sided water-soluble tape, to attach this. Just at least in the beginning till you get the hang of it. Or you can use like a quilt basting glue, and you can glue that on there just to get started. But then once you've done this a couple of times, you won't need anything other than just stopping the machine once in a while and checking to make sure it's lined up correctly, and then continue to sew. Yeah, looks good. We're almost at the end. Now at the end here, you can see where I have, this is the seam allowance for this to be joined to the rest of the quilt. I'm going to stop stitching at the basting stitch. I'm not going to sew that serpentine stitch into the seam allowance because we have to be able to trim that sashing away. And then I'll just do a locking stitch right there at the very end, right on the basting stitch. Okay. And now we just need to sew the serpentine stitch on this side and we're all set. Okay, I have my first strip of sashing sewn on over the raw edges, and I wanted to show you, this is the middle of the quilt and this is the seam allowance. So this is where the other half of the quilt gets sewn to it. And I just cut the sashing and I cut it even with that basting stitch because we don't want to have that bulk in the seam when we sew the two halves together. Now here at the other end, this is the side of the quilt that is going to have the binding sewn to it. So on this side, all you would do is cut that even with the edge of your quilt. So now we can go ahead and sew the sashing to our next section. So here are my two halves completed. I have sashing on both sides, both halves, and now I'm going to take pins, pin them together, and stitch the seam together, and then cover the final seam with sashing. So I'm sewing right on that basting stitch. I'm taking the pins out as I go.